Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the family tree of JD Vance, the current Vice President of the United States and author of the book Hillbilly Elegy. An elegy is a piece of writing that expresses deep reflection, usually involving sadness. And the word hillbilly, well, that's a word that is used in America to describe a certain type of country person, usually from the Appalachian Mountains. Stereotypically, hillbillies are thought of as being poor, uneducated, and prone to violence. Now, while there's some debate over whether or not Vance himself and his immediate relatives were actually ever hillbillies, if we go back far enough on his tree, we do find some, including the two most famous hillbilly families of all time, the Hatfields and the McCoys. So we'll be looking at their family trees in this video as well. But the first thing I need to explain to you about JD Vance is his name. Nowadays, the JD stands for James David, but that wasn't the case when he was born. At birth, his name was James Donald, and his surname was not Vance, but Bowman. You see, Vance is actually his mother's last name, but originally, like most children from Western countries, he took his father's last name. However, when JD was just a toddler, his parents got divorced, and then his mother married a man named Robert Hamill. But that's not all. In order to further distance him from his bio dad, the D in JD was changed from Donald to David. Thus, JD's legal name became James David Hamill. And that's actually the name he used during most of his childhood and young adult years, even after his mother and Robert Hamill got divorced. It wasn't until 2013 that he finally decided to change his surname to Vance. So because Vance is the name that he chose, and because that's the side of the family he grew up with, I'm mostly going to be concentrating on them. Let's start with the origins of the surname. Vance was originally spelled Vans with an S, and that name in turn was likely a misspelling of Vouse, the U being mistaken for an N. But Vouse wasn't the original spelling either. If you go back far enough, we find that it was originally Vo or Devo, which was a Norman surname used in both Ireland and Scotland that meant from the valleys. Let's now look at JD's earliest Vance or Vouse ancestor to arrive in the Americas. That would be Andrew Vance. He was born in 1666 in what is today Northern Ireland, but at some point he decided to immigrate to Virginia, which is where he died in 1754. Andrew was possibly the brother of a certain Elizabeth Vance, who, according to some sources, was the paternal grandmother of U.S. President Andrew Jackson. Now, the sources for this connection aren't the best, which is why I've put question marks. But if true, this would make Andrew Jackson and JD Vance second cousins 8 times removed. What we do know for sure is that Andrew Vance was the son of John Vance and the father of Ephraim Vance. It was Ephraim who built a fort on the frontier of Virginia during the French and Indian War, named Fort Vouse. This fort was attacked and destroyed by the enemy, but later rebuilt and then inspected by none other than George Washington, who at that time was simply a colonel in the British Army. Now, before I move on, I want to tell you about the resource that I personally use to follow important people like JD Vance and to navigate all the different perspectives out there in the media coverage. It's called Ground News, and it's a website and app that allows you to examine thousands of news topics from a variety of different angles. For every breaking story, they combine coverage from multiple sources so that you can compare reporting from across the political spectrum and the world. For example, they recently gathered over 300 articles about Vance's recent trip to India. By the way, you can follow along at home by scanning the QR code on screen or by clicking the link in the description below. Sources on the left were more likely to mention the negative impact of US tariffs on India, whereas sources on the right were more likely to focus on the cultural places that the Vances visited. So obviously, depending on what source you read, you can end up having a totally different perspective, which is why Ground News is so useful. They even have useful charts. I love how their app uses charts like these ones to show additional data on each news source, such as whether they lean to one side politically and even where they get their funding from. It also highlights what isn't being widely covered on the blind spot feed. Thus, it can help you have more productive conversations with family and friends. So, in a world that is constantly changing, ground news is a tool that we all need. Without it, you might miss out on important stories and perspectives. You can subscribe now by going to ground.news/charts or by using the link in the description or pinned comment. If you use my link this month, you will save 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. Okay, let's now return to the family tree of JD Vance. We left off with Ephraim Vance, who built Fort Vance during the French and Indian War. Well, Ephraim had a son named Abner, who was a young man during the next major war, the American Revolution, during which he likely served as a border scout. Later, Abner became a Baptist minister and had several children, including a daughter named Elizabeth, who, according to legend, eloped with a doctor named Lewis Horton. This is important because Abner, who was angry about the relationship, ended up shooting and killing Dr. Horton. As punishment for the murder, Abner was sentenced to hang, and while waiting for his execution, he wrote a song called Vance No More, which became a famous Appalachian folk tune. Abner actually ended up being pardoned by the governor, but the sheriff received the news too late, after he had already been hanged. Now, JD Vance descends from a grandson of Abner Vance named Meakin. But before we look at his line, I want to first tell you about Meakin's first cousins, Nancy and Jim, who were connected to the famous Hatfields and McCoys. Nancy was the daughter of Elizabeth, not by the murdered man, but by someone else. She was born out of wedlock, though, and was therefore adopted by her Uncle William, the father of Jim Vance, who is quite important to the Hatfield and McCoy story. Nancy married Ephraim Hatfield, better known as Big Eph, and together they ended up becoming the matriarch and patriarch of the famous Hatfield family. You see, by this point, Virginia had been divided into Virginia and Kentucky, with several rivers acting as the border between the two. The Hatfields lived on the Virginia side, and the McCoys on the Kentucky side. When the U.S. Civil War broke out, most of the members of both families fought for the Confederates. However, one of the McCoys, named Asa McCoy, fought for the Union. In 1865, when the war was over and he was heading home, Asa was shot and killed by Jim Vance. This and several land disputes led to animosity between the two families. The Hatfields now being led by Nancy's son, William Anderson Hatfield, better known as Devil Anse, and the McCoys now being led by Randolph McCoy, better known as Randall. The next stage in the conflict occurred when there was a dispute over who owned a certain pig, and when Devil Anse's son Jones fell in love with Randall's son Rosanna, setting up a Romeo and Juliet situation. However, unlike in the famous play, in this case, Jones ended up abandoning Rosanna after getting her pregnant and married her cousin Nancy instead. Next, in 1882, 3 of Rosanna's brothers, Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud, got into a fight with Jones's uncle Ellison, which ended up in Ellison being stabbed 26 times and then shot dead. This led to the 3 brothers being arrested, but while they were being transported to jail, a Hatfield-led vigilante group kidnapped and executed them in an event known as the Pawpaw Tree Incident. Over the next 6 years, the feud intensified and then reached a peak on New Year's Eve 1888 when Jim Vance, Cap Hatfield, and others on the Hatfield side surrounded the McCoy home and began shooting, eventually setting the house on fire. During the incident, 2 more McCoys died, including one of the daughters, named Alifair. The McCoys then retaliated by killing Vance and 2 other Hatfield supporters. In the end, it was the Hatfields who were seen as the main aggressors, and 8 of them were indicted for the New Year's Eve massacre. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in the end, 7 Hatfields were sentenced to life in prison, and one named Ellison Mounts, who was a Hatfield but used his mother's surname, was sentenced to death by hanging. That pretty much put an end to the feud, and today the two families get along, even appearing on the game show Family Feud in 1979 and having annual reunions. Okay, let's now move over from the guy who started the whole Hatfield-McCoy saga, Jim Vance, to his cousin Meakin, who, as far as we know, was not involved. Meakin Sr. had a son named Meakin Jr., who in turn had a son named Meakin III. Meakin III then had a son named Wilbur, who died from pneumonia at the young age of 23. His wife, however, was pregnant at the time, and 6 months later gave birth to their son James. James Vance ended up marrying Bonnie Blanton, and it was these two that the young JD Vance knew as Mama and Papa. They feature quite prominently in the book Hillbilly Elegy because they ended up raising JD after his mom spiraled into drug addiction. Take note that in the movie version of Hillbilly Elegy, Mama was played by Glenn Close and JD's mom by Amy Adams. But let me back up a bit and tell you more about the real Mama and her family. She was the daughter of Hattie Hounshell and Blaine Blanton, who were both born in Kentucky and who together had 8 children. Several of Mama's siblings are mentioned in JD's book. Uncle T-Berry and Uncle Pet are both portrayed as being very violent, but fiercely loyal. In contrast, Uncle David, from whom JD supposedly got his middle name, is portrayed as being a sort of hippie-like figure, and Uncle Gary as the quintessential nice guy. When Bonnie was just 13 years old, she became pregnant by James Vance, who was 16 at the time. Because this was illegal, the couple lied on the birth certificate and moved from Kentucky to Ohio to escape the wrath of Bonnie's father. The baby ended up dying, but the couple stayed together, having another child, Uncle Jimmy, when Bonnie was 18 and James was 21. About a decade later, they also had JD's mother, Beverly, as well as her sister, Lori, who JD called Aunt Wee. James and Bonnie's marriage, however, was a rocky one, as James was, for much of his life, an alcoholic. He did, however, land a high-paying job in Ohio at Armco Steel. JD went on to go to Yale and then became a venture capitalist. While at Yale, JD met Usha Chilukuri from California, the daughter of Indian immigrants. Her father, Krishna, taught engineering, and her mother, Lakshmi, taught molecular biology, both at the university level. Usha herself went on to become a lawyer, serving as a clerk for both Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts. Together, JD and Usha have 3 children, aged 7, 5, and 3. Now, before I look at JD's father's side of the family, let me point out a few other Vances that JD is distantly related to. If we go all the way back to Ephraim Vance, you'll see that he had a brother named Samuel, who had a son named David Sr., who had a son named Robert. That Robert served as a U.S. congressman, as well as one of his nephews, who was also named Robert. However, the most notable person on this branch of the tree is Zeb Vance, who served as the governor of North Carolina, both during the Civil War as a Confederate and slave owner, as well as after the war during Reconstruction. He's considered to have been one of the most important Southern leaders during that period. Another Vance who rose high in politics was Cyrus Vance, who served as Secretary of State under Jimmy Carter. His son, Cyrus Jr., went on to lead one of the cases against Donald Trump. I was not, however, able to find a connection between these two Vances and JD Vance, so if they are related, it must be quite distantly. Okay, let me now return to JD's biological father, Donald Bowman. As I mentioned earlier, he and Beverly got divorced early on in JD's life, after which he pretty much faded into the background. Eventually, though, he stopped drinking, became a devout Christian, and raised a family with his new wife. He supported JD's political ambitions, but unfortunately passed away just before JD became vice president. His own father, also named Donald Bowman, died from a heart attack at age 25 when JD's dad was just an infant. So he ended up being raised by his mother, Melva Baker, who eventually remarried. Now, my surname is also Baker, so I was curious as to whether or not I could find a connection between JD Vance's family tree and my own. I was able to trace Melva Baker's line back several generations, but as I suspected, it leads back to England, not Germany, which is where my Baker ancestors came from. So no connection there. Donald Bowman Sr. was the son of Robert Bowman, who was the son of Jacob Bowman, who was the son of Robert Bowman, who was the son of Henry Bowman, who fought in the U.S. Civil War for the North. He in turn was the son of Cornelius Bowman Jr., who was the son of Cornelius Bowman Sr. from Virginia, whose ancestors had come to America from Holland. There they had spelled their name Bouwman, which in Dutch means farmer. So that was a look at the family tree of JD Vance. Don't forget to check out Ground News by going to ground.news/charts. Or you can scan the QR code on screen right now, or click the link in the description or pinned comment. Thanks for watching.